This is Dr. Sandy at Nora's podcast.
Hey, Nora.
Hey, Sandy.
How you doing?
Well, I just biked like 6 kilometers through like those fluffy snowflakes, which are so beautiful. But when you wear glasses on a bike, fluffy snowflakes really make it hard to see. So it's kind of perilous. You know, I just got home, just got to the microphone, and that was something else. That was cool. How are you?
That sounds terrible. I'm great. I have gotten out of the city. I'm doing a little self-organized writing retreat. I'm in the mountains north of Los Angeles, and it's like it feels like an Ontario fall. Like it's really beautiful. Like the trees are all changing colors. It's like this mountainscape where I'm in a mountain that is surrounded by mountains, so it's just like trees all around, and all the leaves have changed, and it's really quite beautiful. I don't like the cold, as you know, but you know it's like 5 degrees and really, 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 really sunny. The like West Coast LA sun is still a part of this beautiful landscape, and it's the perfect place to write. So I'm feeling pretty good.
Yeah, look at you getting all weather diverse again.
I know. Having weather. Look at that. But, you know, as we've talked about before, this year LA had lots of weather, so I shouldn't, say that. Climate change. But how are you? What's up? Like, what's going on? Anything to just kind of wrap about before we get into the topic for today, which is the topic of last week and the topic of the week before that and the topic of the week before that.
Yeah. Well, my next book is done. It's in the hands of the copy editors. So at this point, the actual content is finished. Thank you. So that'll be on sale for pre-sale soon. I'm sure I'll tell you all when that will happen, but it's kind of like amazing to be finished a writing project, because you look at these things like in such intense chunks, right? And you hope that you're building a narrative. And I'm not talking about fiction. I think fiction writing obviously is a bit different, but you look at these things in really intense chunks and you hope that they all fit together. And then you sit back and you're like, oh man, I screwed up, or, oh yes, I did it. And I'm pretty happy with it. So yeah, that's kind of the big thing, I guess, for me this past week.
That's great. I saw the cover. Broken chair, or like really, really old falling apart chair. Cool.
Yeah. Broken chair.
Do you get to decide that, or how does that work? Like, does the publisher decide?
Yeah. So every cover from my experience has been totally different. In this case, the publisher basically pitched it to me and was like, unless you have a huge problem with this, we're going with this. And I was like, I have no huge problems with this. This is sweet. So there's always like a bit of a consultation. What kind of feeling, what kind of words would you use to describe the book? And that, I guess, is given to a designer, and the designer works their magic.
Okay, great. Well, that is really, really exciting. I'm really happy for you. Your writing has always been really great, so I'm excited to read this next edition.
Thank you. And you doing a writing retreat, I know why, because you're getting the end as well to your next project.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel really great about that. I'm feeling really, really great about that. I think the topic is really important, but it's been like, thinking about policing so deeply for so long, it's just like, I try to be an optimistic person, but reading all the stories and choosing the stories and talking to people about the stories that I want to use to highlight the reasons why policing fails, it kind of sucks. It absolutely sucks. But I will say, like, one of the most interesting things that I learned very recently writing is about the history of how the prohibition movement against sex work, which called itself an abolitionist movement, but I don't want to call it that, prevailed in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Do you know the history of that?
I don't.
Well, I continue to be surprised, even though I'm like a race scholar, about how everything is about race. And
it's good. You know what? Bringing that approach is just so good. Like that shock is never let go of it.
Wow. What? It basically, to make a very long story short, there were people who really wanted to to have a prohibitionist approach to sex work, and there were people who wanted a regulationist approach. Both approaches were shitty, but one would have led to a different today than we have today. And the prohibitionists were like super losing until they started to portray sex work as white women's slavery. And it's like, we don't even have slavery for black people anymore. like this is white women's slavery. And that changed the whole game. For that rhetorical shift changed the whole game and led to the success of the prohibition movement.
Wow. And so you're talking late 1800s here, or turn of the century?
Late 1800s to early 1900s. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And to put that into context, too, of a lot of the women's movement at that time being, pro-eugenics, very, very openly white supremacist, but then also bringing in or fighting for public health reforms, putting these things together, understanding how like modern social services come out so often out of the drive to make sure that white supremacy is intact and remains intact and unthreatened within society is so fascinating to me. And so I'm so excited to see how that gets teased out through policing. And that's a big chunk of the first half of my book as well, talking about public services, the social safety net, and how it was built to ensure that Canada had this white Christian nation that was supported more or less by its governments.
Wow. It's almost as though, like we should be working together to talk about such policies and so on. Maybe we should write a book together or, continue to do a podcast.
There was an idea a while ago to have a Sandy and Nora 10 rules for life. We should have done that.
There's still time.
There's still time. That's right. That's right.
Well, you know what else Sandy and Nora are doing really soon? Like super this week?
I know. Yes.
Well, tell me.
We are heading to Winnipeg.
We're going to
Winnipeg Friday night at the West End Cultural Center. You can get your tickets at thepointofsale.com. Just look up Sandy and Nora. We are bringing along John Camille Farah. That is John Farah, the wonderful Palestinian Bramptonian pianist, probably one of the best pianists in Canada. But he doesn't just do piano work. He fuses Middle Eastern sounds with Bach and lots of electronics and lots of samples, and it's really going to be an amazing show, especially because, Sandy, as you know, we got a grand piano for John.
You have a grand piano for John. That's really, really cool. I'm very excited about that. And like for the folks who were in Toronto, they'll know the musical performance piece. It's so stunning. So you folks are really in for a treat, as am I, because I always love doing this stuff. So
yeah.
Yay.
Yeah. So make sure, buy your tickets, obviously. Help us spread the word as well. I kept on running to people after our Toronto show who were like, what? I didn't know you had a Toronto show. And it's like, folks, we're doing our best here. So if you know anyone in Winnipeg or around Winnipeg and you think that they might be fans of Sandy and Nora, just be like, hey, don't forget, Friday night, Sandy and Nora playing Winnipeg. We rely on you to help us get the word out, and that will be a lot of fun. It'll be a lot of fun. So looking forward to that.
Very much so. And Nora, I am sure we have some people to thank. Do we have some gratitude to shell out?
We sure do. Thank you so much to everyone this week that has donated to the podcast for the first time or changed their donations. Thanks also to everyone that stopped donating, who've been donating for a long time. We know you don't have infinite money, so we really, really appreciate the contributions that you have been able to make. This week, especially, thanks to the folks that donated through Patreon. That's patreon.com/Sandy and Nora, especially Zivi, Vincent, Zachary, Melissa, Bella, Aaron, and Susanna. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you all so much. So, Nora, I think we are going to be talking a little bit more about what we've been talking about in the last few weeks, the war. Mm-hmm. But before we get there, I think we should just note that there has been an update to the Michaels story. Do you remember the Michaels story?
I have been waiting for this moment, for the finally the time we can talk about, maybe one of them was a spy.
Yeah, so for listeners who may not remember, there were two Michaels who were detained in China. Canadian Michaels were detained in China. At the time, there was a criminal case against Meng Wanzhou, who was in Canada, and Canada allowed for her to be transferred to the United States for that court case. And it seemed as retaliation that China detained these two Michaels. And China's narrative on it was that these two Michaels were spies from Canada. And Canada, of course, was like, that's outrageous. They're not spies. That's part of China's narrative, and they were detained and found guilty without a proper trial, and so on. And didn't hear much until later. The court case in the U.S. When it was completed, the Meng Wanzhou was released, and I believe it was the same day or the day afterwards, the Michaels were also released and sent back to Canada.
Ah, yes, our glorious Michaels. I mean, this was such a bizarre story. And I think that the fact that it happened during the pandemic was actually important because it gave the Canadian government something to rally Canadians around. So we have these two guys named Michael. So, I mean, like just on the PR side, it's amazing. Two Michaels, two Furious. Although now it's one Furious and two Michaels. But anyway, there's like 300,000 Canadian nationals who are in China. And so for the Chinese government to pick up these two Michaels kind of warranted the questions, okay, so what exactly are they up to? And you'll remember over the course of their detention, they were detained for 1,000 days, more than 1,000 days. I mean, we're talking like devastating levels of detention. Throughout the whole process, Michael Kovrig was more of the public face. You know, his ex-wife was his advocate, and she made many media interventions over the course of the time that he was detained. But Michael Spavor, we didn't hear very much from him. Now, he had the more interesting kind of backstory because Spavor was the one who had these photos of him with the leadership of North Korea, and he operated tours in North Korea. So that was always like, that seems kind of like a weird thing for a Canadian to do. And now he's been arrested for espionage. What's coming out now in the Globe and Mail is that Spavor is suing Kovrig because he's alleging that information that made it to Kovrig from Spavor about North Korea was then sent on to other officials that made it into the Five Eyes security network that Canada is part of with the United States, Australia, UK, and New Zealand. So this is all very, very, very fascinating. And it's not surprising at the fuck all if you like have half a brain. I know on this show we talked many times about whether or not one of them or both of them were probably spies. Of course, espionage is also one of these things that, you know, business secrets and a lot of things can be called espionage that aren't necessarily exactly espionage. But there was no one in the Canadian mainstream media that ever took the time to like question the narrative. Could it be the fact that China is not just randomly picking up two guys named Michael and detaining them in reaction to what we did to Meng Wanzhou? Could there be something else about these two that is actually sending a signal to Canada that China knows very, very well that they actually have engaged in something that looks like espionage? And some of the things that have come out since this news broke this past weekend in the Globe and Mail were like really wonderful memories, like the Globe and Mail asking Canadians to write letters to them, like our two Michaels. Do you remember that?
I fully do not. That's what? No.
Right? Okay. So there was that. There was this wonderful column written by Susan Delacourt, who is just like the worst columnist in Canada. And during the conversations around who Canada should appoint to oversee foreign interference into Canadian politics, she suggested the two Michaels.
Oh my God, what?
Could you imagine? Like, I got guys, I'm the smartest columnist in Canada. Do you know who I think it should be? I'm not going to suggest fucking I don't even know, Mikhail Jean. I'm not gonna suggest fucking. I'm just thinking random people. The John Horgan. I'm gonna suggest the two Michaels, the guys who were probably spies. Okay. No one, I guess, of her editors were like, "Hey, Susan, like this is hilariously bad. Why would you suggest that?" No, that was a column. Okay, fine. And so here it comes out. Now, if the allegations of Spavor's lawsuit are true, that means that Canada allowed these two men to wallow in prison while they played this ridiculous game with the United States with Meng Wanzhou from Huawei. Because like you mentioned earlier that, you know, she was facing criminal charges in the United States because the United States alleged that a subsidiary of Huawei violated bullshit international sanctions against Iran, let's be clear, by allowing some sort of technology to be purchased by Iran in their telecommunications systems. And Canada was like, Donald Trump seems stable. Let's play ball with this guy. Arrest her. And then the Chinese retaliate by arresting the two Michaels. If this was high-level espionage, if this was the case that these guys were not randomly walking down streets in China and pulled off the street and jailed, this means that Canada very well could have put both of their lives into jeopardy over very stupid politics. So I you know, sometimes you get to live long enough to see things happen where you're like, I knew that. And this is one of those situations that I really can't wait for more information to come out on.
Yeah, and CTV is reporting that Spavor is also seeking a multi-million-dollar settlement from Ottawa itself. And that little tidbit about the letters makes Global Affairs Canada's statement make sense because I was like, why does the statement sound like this? I'm going to read the statement to you. So in response to this lawsuit being filed, Global Affairs Canada has said, perpetuating the notion that either Michael was involved in espionage is only perpetuating a false narrative under which they were detained by China. These two men went through an unbelievably difficult ordeal, and every day of their arbitrary detention showed strength, perseverance, resilience, and grace. They inspired all of Canada, and as a country, we breathed a collective sigh of relief when they returned home. I was like, that's such a weird statement. What is this? But yeah, I guess sure.
Yeah, we needed them as a plaything. Sorry, guys.
Awful. Okay, let's move on. Nora, you know, I mentioned this to you the other day, so I'm just going to mention it on the pod. We have a minority government.
Oh my God, I totally forgot.
Yeah, because there's this like weird agreement thing that's happening where it's like, you know, the party that holds the balance of power has agreed to prop up the Liberals for, I don't know, some undisclosed amount of time until the Liberals do what they promised to do several fucking years over. Like, I don't know, like, sure. But if I were in Parliament right now and, I don't know, my party had a position on a war/genocide that was going on, I don't know. For me, this might be a reason to break such a ill-advised agreement. I mean, for me, what do you think?
Yeah, I think, you know, so here we are at week 7, basically, of this horrifying, unjustifiable, indefensible campaign against Gaza that is being done under the auspices of retaliation for to try and get hostages back. I mean, of course, and 1,200 people who were murdered, but the hostages are playing a very key role in this. Israel has leveled parts of Gaza, making them uninhabitable, making them like places that cannot be rebuilt in any kind of short period of time. At the same time, of course, making the conditions probably for those hostages deadly if they're even still alive, right? Like if my whole family was being held by my neighbor, I wouldn't bomb his house into the ground. I'd be doing everything fucking possible to convince my neighbor to give me my family back, right? Like, there's this ridiculous fidelity in mainstream media to continuously believe Israel Believe Israel that this is over the hostages. Believe Israel that this is over the Hamas having headquarters in hospitals or in schools or in UN buildings or whatever. And it's like time and time, we know that these things are not true. That if it was about the hostages, they wouldn't be bombing the West Bank, or they wouldn't be killing people in the West Bank. If it was about the hostages, they would probably agree to some sort of negotiations or ceasefires to actually get hostages released. If it was about the tunnels under Al-Shifa Hospital, we would see evidence of those tunnels. They'd be waving that evidence in our faces all over the place, and Canadian media would be eagerly showing us, and that's not what's happening. And so, as many listeners know, Sandy and I don't really talk about the topics before we get onto the show. And I was really, really, really curious to hear where you think we're at, Sandy. But I think the way that you started this off, and certainly the way that I've been thinking about this, is the lies are becoming too untenable. Mm-hmm. And the lies becoming too untenable because we're seeing evidence that they're not true, but also because of the incredible activism that we're seeing right now, historic levels of activism, mm-hmm. that it is forcing politicians to... I'm not sure, maybe pause, maybe humanitarian pause themselves, maybe pushing some politicians into maybe different directions that they perhaps were weeks ago. Certainly seeing Emmanuel Macron calling for a ceasefire is pretty significant. And so here we're finally in a moment where Justin Trudeau, I mean, he's still weak and he's drama teacherish and it's hard to listen to him because it's very cringy, but he's actually starting to say, oh shit, maybe there is too many. Maybe this is the number, actually. Maybe 1,200 or maybe 12,000 or 15,000 is our red line in Canada. And maybe now we're going to start using different language. And that is a testament to the activism that we're seeing right now. So while it's also very horrible and there's lots of people died, and, there's thousands of people who are trapped under the rubble, and we're hearing this more and more from officials in Palestine, there is cracks in the consensus that are exposed that does actually give me a little bit of hope.
Well, yeah, it shouldn't have been allowed to go on this long without those cracks showing themselves. Like the politicians actually, they have to respond to, like, this is a global mass movement at this point of people demanding that this siege, this genocide not continue, and that at the very least that there's a ceasefire so that people, can be taken care of, supported, saved, and that the siege end itself, if not the occupation. Spain has taken some steps towards recognizing Palestine. Even like there's a lot of shifting that's going on, and quite frankly, for me in Canada, it's taken too long, like to have that many people out on the streets over and over in these sustained actions, and even seeing. Some of the actions that took place this week, the what happened at the Giller Prize, for example, I'm sure we'll talk about. But what I am, the reason why I started the way I did is that, you were starting to see not just Justin Trudeau trying to walk a line or whatever he's trying to do. To appease people who are on the ground, who are clearly saying, like, not only are you unpopular for whatever is going on in Canada, like this could tank you. Like there are so many people, you cannot just remain steadfastly loyal to Israel under these conditions, and the people will not accept that. But we're also starting to see some politicians showing up from the NDP to rallies and making statements of support. And as we've said before on this podcast, we said it, I think, in the first week, there's more than you can do than just statements if you are an elected representative in this country. And certainly if you hold the balance of power, there's a lot more power that you have to be able to force the ruling party to do the right thing, especially if they're teetering. Like, you should be talking about this. And to me, it's a little bit strange, actually, that there hasn't been any sort of discussion about that, like in a political analysis sort of way. Like we have a minority government. Like if people are demanding that something change, and the government that's in power is not changing that thing, then we should be talking to the other parties about like, well, what does this mean for you? And what would you do about it? And if NDP members of the NDP are signifying that they're in favor of a ceasefire, and some even signifying more than that, well, it behooves them to be doing some work behind the scenes to use their power to do something about this.
Yeah, like, it doesn't actually take too much, though, to realize where the NDP is in this, right? The only conversations that journalists and columnists kind of have allowed to have happen on this sucking and blowing agreement between the Liberals and the NDP is whether or not the NDP is ready to pull the plug based on pharmacare. Or, some of the core issues. I've seen some comments on dental, but not really. Pharmacare seems to be the one that people are saying might actually be enough to kill the agreement. But we have evidence of what an NDP in power would do. And we have that evidence in British Columbia and this past couple of weeks in Manitoba. So we've got Premier David Eby and Premier Wab Kinew, who both will not call for a ceasefire. Will not call for a ceasefire.
Indefensible.
It's indefensible. And the only hope that I have is that there are members of the caucus of the NDP federally and of those provincial governments who know that they haven't done enough and that they'll never forgive themselves for the rest of their lives. Because I just don't understand what it feels like. How can you say that you're a progressive person to know what is happening in Palestine, to know that you have access to some level of power, whether it's through triggering the review of this agreement or triggering an election or being literally in power and being still too cowardly to take those positions? This is where we really see it. And I think that it's not just them. It's also in someone like Olivia Chow, who every time she says something that's giving Israel too much benefit of the doubt or literally supporting Israel or whatever, she prefaces it by saying she's a lifelong peace activist. It's like, what are you doing? What do you think you're saying when you preface these things with, as a lifelong peace activist? We see through you.
Yeah, I think, it's really hard to watch this sort of equivocating happening, in part because, as we've said before, we know some of these folks. And I can imagine what some of the conversations are that are going on. Folks are, I'm sure, nervous about what the consequences are going to be if they do the right thing. And so behind closed doors, they'll be like, I'm in favor of this. But, I've heard that multiple times before on this particular issue. And I just like, that just doesn't work for me. Like, it doesn't work for me. It's not going to work for you. For those of you who are listening, it's like, think about, take this to its logical conclusion. Take this all the way. Think about the literal worst thing that could happen here. It has nothing to do with you. The literal worst thing that could happen is not going to be happening to you. It's already happening to other people, but you could have an impact on that. And the worst thing that could happen if you do say something, literally, is that it doesn't have the impact. That's the worst thing that could happen, is that it doesn't, Canada doesn't have the political impact that it needs to have an impact on a genocide that's happening. That's the worst. Whatever you're imagining is the worst. Whatever loss of power that you think you will have in your own life, whatever personal consequence, that is not the worst thing that could happen. And you will realize that in hindsight when you are all going to be punished for not stepping up in the right way and doing the thing that you could have done when you could have done it. Whatever you're imagining is the worst thing. I promise you, there is another worse thing that is happening. Please, zoom out, look at this, see the forest within the trees, just zoom out and take a look at what is actually happening. You can make a decision on who you want to be as this is happening. And look, people on the ground are making that decision very easy for you. People on the ground all over Canada, people on the ground all over the world are making the decision really fucking easy for you. And somehow some of you are still frightened, still afraid. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, the courage that you need to say something, especially as an elected representative, okay? Like, you're one of the most protected people in the country. The courage that you need to say something is like a drop in the hat. It is really not much. Like, if the worst is what happened to Sarah Jama, which is that you're kicked out of your caucus, like, okay, like, okay, now what? You are alive. You still have your family. You still have access to all of your salary, your supports, whatever. You're elected. You are one of the most protected people in the country. Like, what exactly, like, what? It's not even courage. It's literally just the impetus to do the right thing, to step out of line, maybe, or to try to have the conversation behind the scenes. And I hope this is happening, to try to force everyone to make the collective decision to do the right thing. It's not enough to just like say, okay, I've seen the support, and I'm going to myself say that I am in support of this, so that people know that, like, I'm a good person. It's like, it doesn't matter that you're a good person and you have these personal thoughts. You have power. Use it.
Oh, yeah. Like, there's really no question about this. And this is a moment of extreme clarity where things are so obvious. They're rendered less obvious because of the interventions being made in media and from our politicians. But it is very clear on what side justice is here. I mean, it's so obvious. It's like, it's probably the side that says, stop bombing everybody. Stop bombing everybody. And then we can sort everything out, right? And the people who have put their jobs on the lines and their bodies on the lines, like the incredible activism that has shut down bridges, that has shut down the Scotiabank and Union Station in Toronto and lots of roads. You already mentioned the Giller Prize. That was really wonderful to see. And then that triggered a really wonderful statement of other authors in Canada saying, like, condemning how few people at the Giller Prize spoke out in support of those folks. Or, I mean, God, the people that booed, like, fuck them. The activism that we've seen in London with Dr. Tarek Loubani, who's just been arrested potentially because ketchup was sprayed on an MP's office, like, big fucking deal. But here is another case of that. And the journalist at the London Free Press asking Western University if they've got any comment on their faculty member doing this. It's just like, that sucks. Why would you even ask them? What the hell do they have to do with this guy's free time? And then there's so many average people like Zara Al-Akras, who has lost her job from Global News. Arij Anwar. There was Sabrina Dahab, who's a school trustee in Hamilton, who's being investigated because she's posted pro-Palestinian messages online. There's Javier Davila, who's been suspended from the Toronto District School Board, also for comments made online that were pro-Palestinian. There's Mustafa Edzo, who we've talked about already, a pilot with Air Canada. I mean, the list is sadly growing. And at some level, yes, it's scary. You don't want to lose your job. You don't want to lose everything. But folks, like, this is the moment. This is the moment where you put your politics into action. And you put them into action in different ways. You demonstrate your support for Palestinians in different ways. This past weekend, my partner and I got to go to a gala, and we were there with the cabinet minister. And we didn't win. There was a prize, and we were up for a win. And when we lost, my partner leaned over to me and said, "Oh my God, I had a whole speech prepared about Gaza." And the award had nothing to do with international politics. He's like, "Gosh, I really, it's too bad I didn't get the chance to say this, but I'm going to go and talk to the member of parliament anyway, because he has to hear this." And I wore a keffiyeh to the ceremony. And, he comes over because he has to, because we were nominated and we're in his riding. Like, you do the things that you can, and you push these things as hard as you can. And it changes culture. It changes how people are talking about this. And I'm really heartened by the number of people who I know, people in my life who are more or less political, who have, opinions on stuff, but they're not professional opinion makers or anything like that, who say, "Gosh, Nora, I really feel like the tide is changing in a public opinion in Canada in supporting Palestine. That people are really, really supporting Palestinians." And it's like, yes, yes, yes. And every single action we take and every single step of bravery and courage that we take, helps to move that needle along even further. And this is average people putting their bodies on the line. And to go back to the main point, which is the people with any level of power who are not putting themselves on the line, you're cowards. You're fucking cowards. What is it going to take for you to not be a coward? Or are you just so addicted to the job, the office, the title, the fact that you got elected and all this shit to actually do and say the right thing? You're cowards.
Yeah. But the thing, like, even just what you just said, like, this is the piece that doesn't make any sense. As elected representatives, they are the most protected. They will keep their job. They will keep their salary. Their power, I mean, if they're like sort of kicked out of caucus or something like that, then sure, maybe there's like a shift in the amount of power that you have, but your power is still very much up there. Like, not to mention, there will, even from like a cynic's perspective, there are so many people on the ground who clearly will back you up and support you. So what the fuck are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Like, just do the right thing. And like, shout out to all of the organizers, right? Who are doing the right thing in the face of a lot of like, really scary stuff that's going on. The Islamophobia and anti-Semitic attacks by people who are like, you know, the white supremacists who are like salivating at everything that's going on, that people aren't thinking about how this helps their organizing. Yeah, that's a thing that's happening that is scary for communities across Canada. And yet, you know, like in the face of that, like look at what people who are not from the most protected echelons of society are risking. I think, were you reading from the Maple just now when you were talking about the people?
Yes, I was going to shout that article out from Davide Mastracci, but go ahead.
Yeah, so Nora was just mentioning a number of people who have lost their jobs. And there are people who are trying to keep track of these sort of McCarthyist consequences for people who are fucking, just literally showing their support for not genocide, for stop bombing people, for the outrageously bad propaganda campaign that Israel is waging in their. They're kind of like, this is the headquarters of Hamas. Look at this gun next to an MRI machine. Like it's just, again, indefensible and outrageous. And yet, and the consequences continue, and that should be documented because, once the dust settles and we are looking back at this in hindsight, there should be consequences to the employers who made these sorts of decisions. So I'm really glad that the Maple, Davide Mastracci, did I pronounce that right, Nora? Italian?
The local Italian says, yeah, I think so.
Okay. Davide Mastracci has been documenting as much as I think he can get access to in terms of people who have lost their jobs. And so there is an article on the Maple, which is an online news source, independent news, and you can check that article out.
Yeah, and you can also send him tips too. So if you know of anybody or you yourself has faced any kind of repercussions for your advocacy for Palestine, you can email him at opinions@themaple.ca, at readthemaple.ca, or just search it. I'm sure you can find it out. But, we've talked about free speech, and we've talked about pressure and the things that we can do to expose all the lies. And I've already mentioned how the lies are becoming untenable. And I think that that's a really important thing to focus on, that so much of what we've talked about in the past 6 or 7 weeks, and so much of what I'm sure you, dear listener, have been experiencing feels like cognitive dissonance, because it's like, a comment like, well, what about the children that Israel has killed gets turned into, well, actually, this is why. This is the real issue. The real issue is whatever the fuck is the hostages, or is Hamas trying to obliterate Israel or whatever. And it's like, we just have to stay clear-minded in understanding the propaganda war here, and know that the forces that are making all of these things not make any sense, those are the forces that make everything not make any sense. And it's like very, very basic. It's the forces of capitalism and of making as much money off of death and destruction as possible. And, we can see Israel's land grab in a whole bunch of different ways. There's obviously oil interests, and there's been expansion of oil already. There's interest in really, like, literally eradicating a population that has posed a threat to them for, ever since the fucking Israel was dropped into there in the first place. And all of it goes back to the war machine of making sure that there's money to be laundered and that there's people that get rich off of this and that people remain terrorized and afraid. And, it's like tale as old as time, except we're able to watch this in real time. So we have the benefit of seeing things happening in real time in a way that no other generation in the history of the fucking planet has ever gotten to see. And you hope that we're rational, and you hope that we're reasonable people, and that, rationality will win the day someday. And you witness that it doesn't, that you have people like Andrew Coyne saying that Justin Trudeau talking, dramatically about the deaths in Gaza is a betrayal to fucking Israel and all this kind of bullshit, and saying this on a national television station and not getting any blowback and being like, the fuck are you talking about, Andrew Coyne? Shut the fuck up. You get a lot of, calling people who are Zionists, people saying that's anti-Semitic. It's like, well, if I call Ben Mulrooney or Andrew Coyne a fucking Zionist, I'm not being anti-Semitic because they're not Jewish. We have to keep our heads on straight in this stuff. And as the cracks in the consensus continue to grow, I do think that things are going to get worse in terms of there will be more firings and more suspensions and more disciplinary hearings. And I hope that people are considering creating some sort of national support body to help people who do face consequences on the job for their positions for Palestine or for peace.
Yeah, what I can say is, even though we are talking about some of the really disappointing moves or non-moves by people in power, what I can say is that it's really quite obvious that the public support that we are showing from the ground is working. It's not only working in making politicians do the little teeter-tottering, walking the line thing that Justin Trudeau seems to be doing right now. It's also working in the media. Now, I wish I could be talking about Canadian media right now. Not so much. But it is certainly working in media like the BBC, for example, who in the report about Al-Shifa Hospital and the operation that the Israeli forces took on the Al-Shifa Hospital, going through and releasing that video that they said was unedited, the edited video that they said was unedited, that was showing the proof that this was the command center, like they said, showing the reason why they bombed and attacked that hospital, the reason why so many patients, children, infants had to die, taking reporters through a little tour where a paltry amount of weapons were found. And they finished by concluding that either the evidence wasn't found that this was a command center, or it just never was a command center, which is like quite a turn from how BBC had been reporting on this in the first place. And so, yes, that is in part because of the outrageousness of Israel's propaganda campaign, but it's also because of the people on the ground who are demanding better from media, from people in power, from politicians. And so it's working. It's working. It's working too slowly, but it's working. So let's keep on.